Man calls police after finding backpack in woods. Minutes later, he's handcuffed and arrested. Michael Thompson never imagined that a simple morning walk would completely change his life. When he spotted that green backpack tossed among the ferns along the trail he'd walked for 15 years, his first instinct was the same as always, to do the right thing. He immediately called the Pine Valley Sheriff's Office, reporting the find with the same honesty that had guided his 42 years of life. What he didn't know was that inside that seemingly harmless backpack lay evidence that would turn him into the prime suspect in a crime he never committed. When the two officers arrived at the scene 20 minutes after his call, Michael waited patiently beside the backpack, just as any responsible citizen would. But something in Sergeant Reynolds' expression changed drastically the moment he unzipped the bag. His routine demeanor gave way to palpable tension. The younger officer, Officer Wilson, discreetly touched his radio, while the sergeant examined the contents with gloves. A chill ran through Michael's stomach as he realized he was no longer being treated as a cooperative witness, but as someone under suspicion. "Mr. Michael Thompson, you'll need to come with us for questioning," said Sergeant Reynolds, his voice now carrying a formality that hadn't been there minutes before. Still not fully understanding what was happening, Michael agreed to go with them. After all, he had nothing to hide and was always willing to assist justice. It was only when he felt the cold metal of handcuffs around his wrists that reality began to take on a terrifying shape. "There must be some mistake," Michael protested, his voice thick with disbelief. "I just found that backpack. I'm the one. Who called you?" But his words seemed to echo into the emptiness of the woods he knew so well, now transformed into the setting of his worst nightmare. Sergeant Reynolds didn't respond to his questions. He simply repeated standard procedure. As he led Michael to the patrol car, parked on the small dirt road leading to the trail. The green backpack, the cause of all this trouble, was carefully sealed as evidence, its secret still hidden from Michael, yet apparently damning enough to turn him from an upstanding citizen into a suspect. During the drive to the sheriff's office, Michael tried to process what was happening. His mind raced through every possibility, every logical explanation for this absurd situation. He was an accountant, a family man, a respected resident of Pine Valley for over 20 years. He'd never even had a speeding ticket, let alone any involvement in criminal activity. The small town, known for its peacefulness and ecotourism, felt different that Thursday morning. The familiar streets took on a sinister edge when seen through the window of a police car. Michael thought of his wife Jennifer, who was likely preparing breakfast at that moment, waiting for him to return from his usual walk. How would he explain this to her? How would he explain it to their children? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. Now back to the story. At the sheriff's office, Sheriff Robert Johnson, a seasoned 58-year-old man, Michael recognized from community events, greeted him with a grave expression. "Michael, you need to understand the seriousness of the situation," the sheriff began, adjusting his glasses on his aquiline nose. "The contents of this backpack you found are quite incriminating." Michael sat down in the plastic chair offered. To him, his hands still sore from the tight grip of the handcuffs that had been removed just minutes before. "Sheriff Johnson, with all due respect, you've known me for years. You know what kind of man I am. Please, explain to me what's going on." The sheriff opened the backpack on his desk and began removing the items one by one, describing each discovery with the precision of someone who had seen many similar cases. There was a notebook with detailed notes about people's movements in the area, photographs of rural properties taken from strategic angles, and a cell phone with messages suggesting the planning of suspicious activities. "But I've never seen these things before in my life," Michael protested, his voice rising in desperation. "Someone must have lost or abandoned this backpack on the trail. I just found it." The sheriff studied him carefully, searching for signs of deceit or nervousness that could confirm or dismiss his suspicions. What troubled Michael most was the precision of the notes in the notebook. They showed an intimate knowledge of the area that only someone who frequented it regularly could have. And unfortunately, he fit that profile perfectly. His morning walks along the trail were well known to everyone in town. It was a habit he had maintained religiously for 15 years, ever since the doctor recommended regular exercise after a scare with his blood pressure. "Michael, these notes describe the exact route you take every day," the sheriff observed, flipping through the handwritten pages. They include times, descriptions of people who frequent the area, details about isolated properties. How do you explain that? The question echoed in the small, stuffy room of the sheriff's office, where the ceiling fan spun lazily, doing little to ease the heat that was intensifying as the morning wore on. Michael felt his credibility slipping away with each piece of evidence presented. How could he prove his innocence when every circumstance seemed to conspire against him? "Sheriff, anyone familiar with the area could have made these notes. I've walked there for years, that's true, but it doesn't mean I'm involved in whatever this is." The sheriff's phone rang, interrupting the interrogation. Sheriff Johnson answered with a curt, "Hello," and Michael could tell the conversation on the other end was intense. The sheriff's expression changed during the call, growing even more serious. When he hung up, he looked at Michael with a mix of pity and professional resolve. "Michael, I've just been informed there's been a series of thefts at rural properties in the area over the past few weeks," the sheriff said, folding his hands on the desk. "The details of the crimes match exactly with the information in this notebook. Do you understand the gravity of the situation?" Michael felt the world spinning around him. Everything was falling into place in a terrible, unjust way. "I had nothing to do with those thefts," he exclaimed, his voice trembling. "I work all day at the accounting office. My wife can confirm it, my clients can confirm it. How could I be involved in thefts?" But even as he protested his innocence, Michael knew his situation was quickly growing more complicated. Sheriff Johnson sighed heavily. He was a fair man who had known Michael for years and was aware of his reputation in the community, but the evidence was too circumstantial to ignore. "Michael, I'm going to have to keep you here for further questioning. You have the right to an attorney. I recommend you contact someone." As he was led to a temporary holding cell, Michael thought about how his life had turned into a nightmare in just a matter of hours. The walk that was his moment of peace and reflection had become the catalyst for his downfall. The forest he loved, where he found tranquility to face the challenges of daily life, was now the setting for his disgrace. The first person Michael thought to call was Jennifer, his wife of 18 years. But how could he explain the situation without causing her devastating shock? Jennifer had a fragile heart, literally. She had suffered a heart attack 2 years earlier, and since then Michael had made every effort to keep her away from any unnecessary stress. The news of his arrest could be more harmful than any medical treatment could fix. He decided to call his brother-in-law Richard first, a criminal defense attorney in Chicago, hoping he could guide him on the first steps. Richard was married to Karen, Jennifer's younger sister, and though they weren't particularly close, Michael knew he could count on his professional competence. "Richard, it's Michael. I need your help urgently," Michael said when the call was answered. "I've been arrested at the Pine Valley Sheriff's Office over a terrible misunderstanding." On the other end of the line, the initial silence gave way to a series of technical questions. Richard fired off with the speed of someone used to handling legal emergencies. "Michael, don't say anything else over the phone," Richard instructed after hearing a summary of the situation. "I'm leaving Chicago now and will be there in 3 hours. Until then, don't answer any more questions without me present. And, Michael, does Jennifer know?" The question Michael dreaded came with the gentleness of someone who knew his sister-in-law's health condition. "I haven't told her yet. I don't know how to do it without risking her health," Michael confessed, his voice heavy with anguish. "Richard, I didn't do anything. I just found a backpack and did what any responsible citizen would do. How did this turn against me?" The question echoed over the phone line without an easy answer. Richard promised to get there as soon as possible and advised Michael to stay calm and not make any statements until he arrived. But what Richard didn't know was that Michael's situation was about to get even more complicated. The moment Michael hung up the phone, Sergeant Reynolds received a new call that would completely change the course of the investigation. The call was from Mrs. Dorothy Miller, the owner of one of the properties that had been targeted in recent thefts. The 73-year-old woman, known for her sharp memory and observant nature, had information that could be crucial to the case. "Sergeant, I saw a strange man lurking around my property last night," Mrs. Miller reported, her voice steady, despite her advanced age. "Can you describe him?" asked Sergeant Reynolds, ready to note every detail. The description Mrs. Miller provided was detailed. A man around 35 years old with dark hair, wearing a green military jacket and carrying a backpack. Michael didn't match several aspects of the description, but the mention of the backpack made the sergeant take careful notes. When Richard arrived at the sheriff's office 3 hours later, he found Michael in a state of deep distress. The lawyer was a polished 45-year-old man, accustomed to the courts of the capital, but the simplicity of the small-town sheriff's office didn't intimidate him. He had started his career in towns just like Pine Valley before settling in Chicago. "Michael, let's go over everything in detail," Richard said, sitting beside his brother-in-law in the room reserved for attorney-client conversations. "First, I want you to tell me exactly what happened from the moment you left home for your walk until the moment you were arrested." Michael recounted every detail he could remember, from deciding to take a slightly different trail to the moment he spotted the backpack among the vegetation. Richard meticulously noted everything down, looking for inconsistencies or details that might be important for the defense. "The most important thing right now is to understand exactly what you're being accused of," Richard explained. "The evidence is circumstantial, but in a small town where everyone knows each other, even circumstantial evidence can be problematic." Richard knew cases like this required a careful approach, balancing technical defense with managing local reputation. As the lawyer and client spoke, Sheriff Johnson received an unexpected visitor. Earl Simmons, a man with a rugged appearance and blunt manners, arrived at the sheriff's office claiming to have information about the recent thefts in the area. Earl was known in town as a man of erratic behavior, living on a small property at the edge of the woods and rarely interacting with the townsfolk. "Sheriff, I know who's behind these thefts," Earl declared, his rough voice cutting through the silence of the office. "And it's not Michael Thompson. That man wouldn't hurt a fly." Sheriff Johnson looked at Earl with renewed interest. He knew of his reputation as a loner, but also that he had unique knowledge about activity in the woods. "What do you know, Earl?" the sheriff asked, gesturing to a chair for the unexpected visitor. Earl reluctantly sat down, clearly uncomfortable, inside the sheriff's office, but determined to share his information. "There's a group of outsiders operating in the area for the past few weeks," Earl began, choosing his words carefully. "I've seen them several times during my nighttime walks. They're not from around here. They speak with a different accent, use equipment that's not common in these parts." Earl's revelation opened a new perspective on the case. Sheriff Johnson asked for details about these observations, and Earl described a group of 3 men who seemed to be systematically studying the properties in the area. His descriptions didn't match Michael Thompson at all, and some of the details he mentioned aligned with the description Mrs. Miller had provided earlier. "Why didn't you report this before?" the sheriff asked, intrigued by the timing of Earl's revelation. The answer came with the typical distrust of someone who lived in isolation. "I don't like meddling in other people's business, but when I heard they arrested Michael for this, I couldn't stay silent. That man helps everyone in town. He doesn't deserve this." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot for those of us just starting out. Now, continuing. Earl's information added a new dimension to the case, but also raised questions about his credibility. Sheriff Johnson knew he'd need to investigate further before considering releasing Michael. Meanwhile, at the Thompson home, Jennifer was starting to worry about her husband's unusual delay. Michael always returned from his walks promptly at 8 in the morning, in time for breakfast with the family before heading to the office. Now it was past 10, and his phone was off, something completely out of the ordinary. Jennifer felt that familiar tightness in her chest, the same one that preceded her heart episodes. She tried calling the accounting office where Michael worked, but the secretary, Mrs. Betty, informed her he hadn't arrived yet and hadn't called about any delay. "It's very strange, Mrs. Jennifer," Mrs. Betty remarked. "Dr. Michael never runs late without letting someone know. Have you tried calling him?" Jennifer explained that Michael's phone was turned off, and Mrs. Betty suggested that maybe he'd had car trouble or decided to take a longer hike. but Jennifer knew her husband too well to accept such simple explanations. Michael was a man of strict habits, especially after his heart attack. He wouldn't change his routine without warning. Jennifer's worry deepened when she decided to call a few neighbors to ask if they'd seen Michael that morning. Mrs. Parker, who lived next door and always greeted Michael when he left for his walk, confirmed she'd seen him leave as usual, at 6:30 in the morning, wearing his usual hiking clothes. "Jennifer, dear, maybe you should call the hospital," Mrs. Parker suggested, her voice filled with genuine concern. "He might have fallen ill on the trail, and someone could have taken him for medical help." The suggestion made sense, but it also terrified Jennifer, who immediately imagined scenarios where Michael had suffered another heart issue. At the Pine Valley Community Hospital, there was no record of Michael Thompson being admitted that day. Jennifer also called Aspen Mercy Medical Center in the neighboring town, but found no information about her husband there either. That's when she decided to call the sheriff's office, never imagining that Michael was actually there, not as a victim, but as a suspect. "Pine Valley Sheriff's Office, Officer Wilson speaking," answered the young officer who had been part of Michael's arrest. Jennifer explained her concern about her husband's disappearance, and Officer Wilson grew visibly uncomfortable. How could he explain to a wife that her husband was being held in their own station? "Ma'am, I need to transfer your call to Sheriff Johnson," Officer Wilson said, quickly passing the phone. Sheriff Johnson, aware of Jennifer's delicate health condition through community talk, knew he had to handle the situation with extreme care. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Sheriff Johnson," he said in a calm, controlled voice. "Your husband is fine and is here at the station. He's been involved in a situation that requires clarification, but physically he's okay." The sheriff chose his words carefully, trying to inform without causing panic. The silence on the other end lasted nearly a full minute. Jennifer had to sit down, her legs giving way as she processed the information. "Sheriff Johnson, I don't understand. What kind of situation? Why is Michael at the station?" Her voice trembled with a mix of relief that he was alive and fear over what might have happened. "Mrs. Thompson, it would be best if you came here, so we can talk in person," the sheriff suggested. "I can send a patrol car to pick you up if needed." But Jennifer was already grabbing the car keys, ignoring her doctor's advice to avoid driving under extreme stress. Her husband needed her, and that was all that mattered right now. The 10-minute drive to the station felt like hours to Jennifer. Her mind raced through every possibility. From car accidents to health issues Michael might have tried to hide from her. It never crossed her mind that he could be involved in anything criminal. When she arrived at the station, Jennifer was greeted by Sheriff Johnson with the courtesy reserved for delicate situations. The sheriff explained the basics. Michael had found a backpack in the woods, called to report it, and ended up being arrested when the contents revealed evidence tied to recent thefts in the area. "But that's ridiculous," Jennifer exclaimed, her voice growing stronger as she took in the information. "Michael is the most honest person I know. He wouldn't even steal candy from a child, let alone commit crimes against property." Jennifer's passionate defense echoed through the halls of the sheriff's office, drawing curious glances from the staff. Sheriff Johnson allowed Jennifer to speak with Michael for a few minutes, supervised by an officer. The reunion was emotionally devastating for both. Michael had never seen his wife so pale and shaken, and Jennifer had never imagined seeing her husband in such a situation. "Jennifer, I'm so sorry this is happening," Michael said, holding his wife's hands. Through the bars of the temporary cell. "Does Sandavi, you need to take care of your heart. Promise me you'll take your medicine and not stress too much. Richard is coming from Chicago to help me." Michael was more worried about Jennifer's well-being than his own situation. Jennifer gripped her husband's hands tightly, as if she could transmit her faith in his innocence through touch. "Michael, I know you didn't do anything wrong. We'll fix this. Richard will fix this." Her voice was firm, but Michael could see tears forming in her eyes. After Jennifer's visit, Michael felt even more determined to prove his innocence. It wasn't just his reputation at stake, but his family's well-being. Jennifer needed stability and peace to maintain her heart health, and their children, Ryan, 16, and Emily, 14, would soon learn about their father's situation. Richard arrived at the sheriff's office just as Jennifer was leaving, visibly shaken but determined. The brothers-in-law exchanged brief greetings, and Richard assured Jennifer he would do everything in his power to resolve the situation quickly. "Jennifer, trust me. Michael will be home today if I have anything to say about it," the lawyer promised. The first thing Richard did was request a formal meeting with Sheriff Johnson to understand exactly what evidence existed against Michael and the legal basis for his detention. The sheriff, respecting protocol, presented all the evidence found in the backpack and explained the connections to the recent thefts. "Sheriff Johnson, you have a man with no criminal record, known throughout the community as honest and hard-working, who voluntarily reported finding evidence," Richard argued. "The evidence is purely circumstantial and could have multiple explanations. There's not enough legal basis to keep him detained." Sheriff Johnson acknowledged the validity of Richard's arguments but also felt the pressure from the community to solve the ongoing thefts. Michael's presence at the scene and his detailed knowledge of the area, as shown by the notes in the backpack, were coincidences hard to ignore, even considering his reputation. "Attorney Richard, I understand your arguments," Sheriff Johnson replied. "But I also have to consider that these thefts are causing great concern in the community. Rural families are afraid, and there's pressure to find those responsible quickly." The tension between justice and social pressure was evident in the sheriff's voice. It was then that Officer Wilson entered the room with new information. That would change the entire course of the investigation. "Sheriff Johnson, we just got a call from Mr. Harold Peterson, owner of the Pleasant Ridge Farm. He says he saw suspicious activity on his property early this morning and wants to file a formal report." The Pleasant Ridge Farm was about 3 miles from the trail where Michael had found the backpack. If there had been criminal activity there in the early hours, it would have been impossible for Michael to be involved. He had been home with his family until leaving for his morning walk at 6:30. Sheriff Johnson decided to go personally to the farm to hear Harold Peterson's account, taking Sergeant Reynolds with him. Richard requested permission to join the investigation, arguing that any evidence collected could be relevant to his client's defense. The sheriff agreed, acknowledging that transparency would be important to maintain the credibility of the investigation. The Pleasant Ridge Farm was a large property, specializing in dairy cattle and family farming. Harold Peterson, a 62-year-old man with the sturdy build of someone who had worked the land for decades, received the group with visible concern. "Sheriff Johnson, something very strange happened last night," began Harold, leading the group to a shed at the back of his property. "My dog started barking intensely around 2 in the morning. When I went out to check, I saw 3 men tampering with my farming equipment." Harold explained that he had shouted at the intruders, who immediately fled toward the woods. He had tried to follow them with a flashlight, but they knew the area well and quickly disappeared among the trees. "The strange thing is they didn't take anything valuable," Harold noted. "They just messed with the equipment as if they were looking for something specific." The description Harold gave of the intruders didn't match Michael Thompson's appearance. The men were younger, wore dark clothing, and seemed to be coordinating their actions professionally. "One of them was carrying a large backpack," Harold added, a detail that made Richard and the sheriff exchange meaningful glances. "Mr. Peterson, could you show us exactly where the men were and which direction they fled?" asked Sheriff Johnson. Harold led them to the shed, where tractors, milking equipment, and various farming tools were stored. On the packed dirt floor, the intruders' footprints were still visible. Richard carefully observed the marks on the ground, noting there were at least 3 distinct sets of footprints, confirming Harold's account of multiple intruders. The footprints led toward the woods, separating the farm from the trail where Michael had found the backpack, suggesting a possible connection between the 2 events. "Sheriff Johnson, this evidence completely changes the context of the case," Richard argued, pointing to the footprints. "It's clear there's an organized group operating in the area, and the backpack my client found may have been abandoned by them during their escape from this property." Sergeant Reynolds took detailed photographs of the footprints and the scene, documenting everything for later analysis. The investigation was taking a completely different direction, and the possibility of Michael's innocence was becoming increasingly evident. While the team investigated the farm back at the sheriff's office, Earl Simmons waited patiently, to provide more details about his observations of the suspicious men. When Sheriff Johnson returned, he found Earl talking to the officer on duty about the activities he had witnessed in the forest. "Earl, I need you to tell me everything you saw, down to the smallest details," Sheriff Johnson requested, preparing to formally record the statement. Earl, despite his reserved nature, demonstrated a surprisingly detailed memory about the suspicious activities he had observed. "Sheriff, I first saw them 2 weeks ago," Earl began, his account gaining fluency as he continued. "3 men, always together, always carrying equipment. It wasn't normal camping gear. It looked like work tools, professional flashlights, ropes, things criminals would use." Earl described how he had watched the men over several nights, always keeping his distance to avoid detection. His solitary life in the forest had given him observation skills most people didn't possess. They were mapping the area, Sheriff, taking notes, photos, studying the rural properties systematically. Earl's description matched perfectly, with the contents found in the backpack Michael had turned in. The detailed notes, the photographs of the properties, the mapping of the area, everything suggested the backpack belonged to the real criminals, not Michael. "Earl, would you be able to recognize these men if you saw them again?" asked Sheriff Johnson. Earl's affirmative answer opened the possibility of future identification if the suspects were caught. With new evidence piling up, Sheriff Johnson found himself in a delicate situation. The case against Michael was quickly falling apart, but he still had to be cautious not to jeopardize the investigation into the real culprits. Richard pressed for his client's immediate release, arguing there was no legal basis to keep him detained. "Sheriff Johnson, with all due respect, my client is being held based on evidence we now know belongs to others," Richard argued vehemently. "Justice demands he be released immediately so he can return to his family." Sheriff Johnson recognized the validity of Richard's arguments, but was also worried about the implications of releasing Michael, only to later discover he'd made a mistake. The investigation was moving quickly, but there were still gaps to fill. Then a crucial piece of information arrived at the sheriff's office that would seal Michael Thompson's fate that day. The forensics lab had found fingerprints on the backpack that didn't belong to Michael. More importantly, they matched criminal records of individuals known for similar crimes in other regions. "Sheriff Johnson, we just received the forensics report," announced Officer Wilson, handing over a sealed envelope. The sheriff opened the document eagerly, and his expression shifted as he read the results. The fingerprints on the backpack belonged to Scott Williams Anderson, known in criminal records for involvement in rural thefts and property invasions. The fingerprint revelation was the final blow to the case against Michael. There was no way to argue he could have planted a known criminal's fingerprints on a backpack he'd found. The evidence was irrefutable. Michael Thompson was innocent. Richard could barely contain his satisfaction when Sheriff Johnson showed him the forensic report. "Sheriff Johnson, I believe there's no longer any doubt about my client's innocence," Richard said, maintaining professional composure despite the clear victory. Sheriff Johnson nodded gravely, acknowledging he'd made a mistake keeping Michael detained for so long on circumstantial evidence. "Mr. Richard, I'll arrange for Mr. Thompson's immediate release. I apologize for the inconvenience caused to his family." His words carried sincere regret. When Michael was informed of his release, he felt a mix of relief and bitterness. The relief of knowing his innocence had been proven was immense, but the bitterness of enduring such a humiliating ordeal lingered. "Sheriff Johnson, I understand you were just doing your job," Michael said with dignity. "I only hope the real criminals are caught soon." Michael's release was a moment of joy, but also a reflection on how circumstantial evidence can destroy an innocent person's life. Richard accompanied Michael to the exit of the sheriff's office, where Jennifer waited with tears of relief in her eyes. The reunion between Michael and Jennifer was deeply moving. She had endured the most agonizing hours of her life, imagining terrible scenarios, and seeing him free and cleared of all charges was more than she could have hoped for. "Michael, I always knew you were innocent," she said, hugging him tightly. "I never doubted you, not for a second." Richard watched the scene with professional satisfaction, but also with a renewed understanding of how the justice system can impact innocent families. "Michael, Jennifer, you should consider filing for emotional damages," Richard suggested. "What happened today was a serious mistake that caused unnecessary suffering for your family." Michael, however, had no interest in lawsuits or revenge. His only concern was returning to normalcy and taking care of Jennifer's health, which had been severely shaken by the day's events. "Richard, I just want to put this behind me and move forward," Michael said. "Life's too short to spend it holding grudges." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just getting started. Now continuing. In the days that followed, the investigation into the real criminals progressed quickly. The fingerprints found on the backpack led investigators to Scott Williams Anderson and his accomplices, Brian Davis Cooper and Paul Roberts Brown. The trio had been responsible for a series of thefts on rural properties, not only in Pine Valley, but in several towns across the region. The arrest of the true criminals brought relief to the entire rural community, which had endured weeks of fear and uncertainty. Harold Peterson was one of the first to visit Michael and apologize for any suspicions he might have harbored against him. "Michael, I'm sorry if I ever doubted your honesty," Harold said sincerely. "You're a man of integrity and everyone in the community knows it." The traumatic experience gave Michael a new perspective on the fragility of reputation and the importance of community support. He received dozens of calls and visits from townspeople expressing their solidarity and outrage over how he had been treated. Mrs. Dorothy Miller was one of the most emotional visitors, bringing a homemade cake and many apologies for not speaking up sooner about her observations. "Michael, my dear, I saw those strange men several times, but I didn't say anything because I thought the police wouldn't care about an old woman's observations," Mrs. Miller confessed, her words heavy with regret. "If I had spoken up sooner, you wouldn't have gone through this humiliation," Michael reassured her, explaining she couldn't have known her observations would be important. "Mrs. Miller, this isn't your fault. What matters is that the truth came out, and the real criminals were caught," he said with his characteristic kindness. It took Jennifer a few weeks to fully recover from the stress caused by her husband's arrest. Her cardiologist, Dr. Frank Anderson, recommended rest and anxiety medication until she felt emotionally stable again. "Jennifer, events like this can trigger heart problems," the doctor explained. "It's important you take care of your emotional health." The support of family and friends was crucial for Jennifer's recovery. Her sister Karen came from Chicago to stay with her for a few days, helping with household chores and keeping her company during her recovery. "Jennifer, you need to take care of yourself," Karen insisted. "Michael is fine, everything has been resolved. Now it's time to focus on your health." Michael and Jennifer's children, Ryan and Emily, were also affected by the incident, though they only learned about their father's arrest after everything had been settled. When Michael told them what had happened, both were shocked at the possibility of having lost their father over a misunderstanding. "Dad, I can't believe this happened," said Ryan, who at 16 already showed the maturity to understand the gravity of the situation. "I'm glad it all worked out, but it must have been awful for you and Mom." Emily, younger and more emotional, hugged her father tightly, as if she could retroactively protect him from the suffering he had endured. The experience strengthened the Thompson family bonds, but also left emotional scars that would take time to fully heal. Michael developed mild anxiety about his morning walks, always afraid of stumbling upon something that might once again jeopardize his reputation. "Jennifer, sometimes I think about stopping the walks," Michael confessed one evening as they watched TV together on the couch. "I don't want to risk getting involved in a situation like that again." Jennifer held her husband's hand, understanding his fears, but also knowing how important the walks were for his physical and mental health. "Michael, you can't let this bad experience stop you from doing something you love that's good for you," Jennifer said wisely. "The criminals were caught. People know you're innocent. Don't let fear take over your life." Her words echoed in Michael's heart, reminding him he couldn't let one traumatic event completely change how he lived. Richard stayed in regular contact with the family in the following weeks, keeping up with the case's progress and ensuring there would be no further legal complications. The lawyer was impressed by the dignity with which Michael had handled the entire situation. "Michael, I truly admire how you faced this adversity," Richard said during one of his visits. "Not everyone could keep their composure in such an unfair situation." The investigation revealed the criminals had specifically chosen Pine Valley for its quiet nature and lower police presence, compared to bigger towns. They had spent weeks studying rural properties, identifying the most vulnerable targets, and planning their thefts with military precision. The backpack Michael found had been abandoned by the criminals during their escape from Harold Peterson's farm when they were startled by barking dogs. Scott Williams Anderson, the group's leader, had dropped the backpack while jumping a fence and didn't have time to retrieve it during their frantic escape through the woods. Sheriff Johnson made a point of visiting Michael personally to offer a formal apology for how the case had been handled. "Michael, I admit I made mistakes in conducting the investigation," the sheriff said humbly. "I should have considered your reputation in the community more carefully before making hasty decisions." Michael accepted the apology gracefully, acknowledging the man was only trying to do his job in a complex situation. "Sheriff Johnson, I understand you were under pressure to solve the thefts quickly," Michael replied. "What matters is that justice was served in the end." The case gained attention in the local press, with the Pine Valley Herald publishing a detailed article about Michael's wrongful arrest and the subsequent capture of the real criminals. The piece emphasized the importance of not rushing to judgment based solely on circumstantial evidence. The media coverage brought additional support for Michael, but it also renewed his public exposure in ways that weren't always comfortable. Many people stopped him on the street to express their solidarity, while others asked curious questions about details of the experience he'd rather forget. "Michael, you've become a bit of a local celebrity," joked his friend John Smith, owner of the stationery shop where Michael bought his office supplies. "Everyone in town is talking about your story." Michael smiled politely, but inside, he wished the attention would fade quickly. The experience also led him to reflect deeply on the justice system and the presumption of innocence. He began paying closer attention to similar cases in the news, developing a special empathy for people going through situations like his. "Jennifer, now I understand better how easy it is for an innocent person to end up in a desperate situation," Michael remarked after watching a news report about another questionable arrest. "It's terrifying to think how many people might be suffering similar injustices." The experience had made him more aware of social issues that hadn't captured his attention before. Earl Simmons became an unlikely hero in the community for having the courage to stand up for Michael when everyone else seemed convinced of his guilt. The solitary man who lived isolated in the woods gained a new perspective on his place in the community. "Earl, I don't know how to thank you for speaking up in my defense," Michael said when he ran into Earl in town a few weeks later. "Your courage made all the difference for my family." Earl, unaccustomed to praise, looked visibly embarrassed but pleased to have done the right thing. "Michael, I know what it's like to be judged when people don't know the truth," Earl replied, indirectly referring to the prejudices he faced because of his isolated lifestyle. "I couldn't stay silent seeing it happen to a good man like you." His answer revealed a depth in Earl that few people in town had ever seen. The arrest of the real criminals brought closure to the case, but also exposed the extent of their illegal activities in the region. Besides the thefts in Pine Valley, the trio was responsible for similar crimes in Aspen, Oak Ridge, and other towns in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The investigation revealed they had been operating for over a year, always following the same pattern. They selected small, quiet towns, studied rural properties for weeks, and carried out coordinated thefts before moving to another area. The meticulous mapping work found in their backpack even impressed seasoned investigators. "I've never seen such organized criminals in rural theft cases," commented the lead investigator on the case. "They turned crime into an almost business-like operation." The conviction of the three criminals brought justice to all their victims, including several families who had lost valuable equipment and felt violated by the invasion of their properties. Harold Peterson, one of the most recent victims, expressed relief when he heard about the sentencing. "Now I can sleep peacefully knowing these men can't harm anyone else," Harold said, "and I feel better knowing Michael was completely cleared. That man didn't deserve what he went through." Harold's sentiment was shared by the entire rural community in the area. Months after the incident, Michael resumed his morning walks, though he now carried a cell phone and always let Jennifer know if he changed his usual route. The experience had taught him the importance of simple precautions he once considered unnecessary. "It's strange how one event can change our perspective on such simple things," reflected Michael, during a conversation with Richard, who had become a close family friend after the case. "Now I think twice before touching any object I find on the trail." Richard understood Michael's shift in perspective perfectly. He had seen many clients go through similar experiences that permanently altered their worldview. "Michael, it's natural for you to be more cautious now," Richard said. "The important thing is not to let that caution turn into paranoia." The experience also brought a new appreciation for family and true friends. Michael realized that during his toughest moments he had discovered who truly cared for him and was willing to stand by him unconditionally. "Jennifer, this experience showed me just how much you and the kids mean to me," Michael said one special evening he organized to celebrate the first anniversary of his exoneration. "It also showed me how many true friends we have in this community." The intimate gathering included only family and the closest friends who had offered support during the crisis. The first anniversary of Michael's arrest and subsequent release was marked quietly but meaningfully. The family decided to use the date to reflect on the lessons learned and to thank those who had stood by them during the difficult time. "A year ago, our lives were turned upside down," Jennifer said during the celebratory dinner. "But we also discovered things about ourselves and our community that we might never have learned otherwise." Her words perfectly captured the family's perspective on the traumatic yet transformative experience. Ryan and Emily, now more mature because of what they'd been through, showed a newfound appreciation for family stability and the importance of personal integrity. "Dad, I always knew you were a person of integrity," Emily said during the celebration. "But now I understand the value of that integrity even better." Michael Thompson's story became a local legend about the importance of not jumping to conclusions and the value of moral courage in times of crisis. Earl Simmons, in particular, was often held up as an example of someone who had the courage to stand up for the truth when it was unpopular to do so. Michael's story teaches us that we must always presume innocence until guilt is proven, Father Michael remarked during a homily at the local church. And Earl's story teaches us that we must have the courage to stand by our neighbors when they need us. The priest's words resonated through the community, reinforcing the moral lessons of the ordeal. The experience also inspired changes in how the local sheriff's office conducted investigations involving respected community members. Sheriff Johnson implemented new protocols requiring stronger evidence before making arrests, especially for individuals with no criminal history. "The Michael case taught us that we must be more thorough in our investigations," Sheriff Johnson explained during a community meeting on public safety. "A person's reputation in the community should be considered an important factor, not ignored." The change was well received by the community, who appreciated the acknowledgement that mistakes had been made. 2 years after the incident, Michael had firmly established himself as one of the most respected members of the Pine Valley community. His dignified handling of adversity had further elevated his reputation, and many people sought his advice on overcoming personal hardships. "Michael, you've become an inspiration to so many people in town," remarked Mrs. Betty, his secretary at the accounting office. "People see how you faced that unfair situation with dignity and learn from your example." Michael felt embarrassed by the praise but understood his experience had deeply touched the community. The relationship between Michael and Earl Simmons grew into an unexpected but profound friendship. The two men, so different in personality and lifestyle, found common ground in integrity and moral courage. "Earl, you've taught me so much about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard," Michael said during one of his visits to Earl's remote property. "Your courage saved my family from prolonged suffering." Their friendship became one of the most positive aspects of the entire traumatic experience. Jennifer recovered fully from the heart issues caused by the stress of the incident, but carried a new appreciation for life's fragility and happiness. "That day taught me to cherish every moment of peace we have," she said during a routine checkup with her cardiologist. "I'll never take our peaceful life for granted again." Michael Thompson's story continued to inspire discussions about justice, community, and moral courage in Pine Valley long after the events had passed. The green backpack that had caused all the confusion became a symbol of how appearances can deceive and how the truth always finds a way to emerge. "Sometimes I think about that backpack and how a simple object can completely change the course of our lives," Michael reflected during his morning walk, now occasionally joined by other townsfolk who had adopted the healthy habit. "But I also think about how truth and justice prevailed in the end." 6 months after his release, when life seemed to have returned to normal, Michael received an unexpected call that brought back all the memories of that terrible day. It was from Sheriff Johnson, with news that would once again shift his perspective on the entire experience. "Michael, I need to speak with you in person," said the sheriff, his voice carrying a seriousness that sent a familiar chill through Michael's stomach. "There have been developments in the case you need to know about." The call came on a Tuesday morning, just as Michael was preparing for his usual walk. He felt Jennifer watching him with concern as he hung up. After months of calm, they had both developed a heightened sensitivity to anything that might disturb their hard-won peace. "What did the sheriff want?" Jennifer asked, noticing the tension in her husband's expression. "He wants to talk to me about the case," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice steady to avoid alarming her. "He said there are new developments." Jennifer felt her heart race, immediately recalling the stress that had nearly caused serious harm to her health. At the sheriff's office, Sheriff Johnson greeted Michael with a mix of discomfort and concern. "Michael, thank you for coming so quickly," he said, gesturing to the same chair Michael had sat in during his questioning months earlier. "What I need to tell you is complicated." Michael sat down, trying to control the rising anxiety within him. "Sheriff Johnson, please be direct. After everything I've been through, I'd rather know the problem right away." His past experience had taught him that prolonging uncertainty only made the suffering worse. Sheriff Johnson let out a heavy sigh before he began. "Michael, last week we received information that one of the criminals who were arrested, Scott Williams Anderson, is claiming you had knowledge of their activities." The revelation hit Michael like a bolt from the blue. "That's absurd," protested Michael, his voice rising involuntarily. "I'd never seen that man in my life before any of this happened." Sheriff Johnson raised his hand, urging calm, clearly expecting this reaction. "Michael, I know it's absurd, we all do," the sheriff said firmly, but his allegations were specific enough to catch the district attorney's attention in Chicago. "He's claiming you approached him to provide information about the rural properties in the area." Michael felt the world spin around him again. He was reliving the nightmare he thought was behind him. "But why would he do this? Why lie about me?" he asked, his voice trembling with indignation and fear. "He's likely trying to reduce his own sentence by claiming he had local accomplices," Sheriff Johnson explained. "It's a common tactic among desperate criminals. They make up stories to spread the blame and lessen their own responsibility." The explanation made legal sense, but it did nothing to ease the emotional toll on Michael. He had spent months recovering from the trauma of the first accusation, and now he was being dragged back into the same terrible situation. "Sheriff Johnson, what does this mean for me?" Michael asked, dreading the answer. "Will they arrest me again based on this? Man's lies." The thought of going through all that again was terrifying. "No, Michael," the sheriff assured him quickly. "This time we're being much more careful. Scott's allegations are completely inconsistent with the evidence we have. Plus, we have statements from several people in the community vouching for your character and routine during the time in question." Sheriff Johnson opened a folder on his desk, showing Michael a stack of documents. "We've collected voluntary statements from Mrs. Parker, Harold Peterson, Earl Simmons, and over a dozen others who can confirm you never had contact with the criminals." The community's show of support moved Michael deeply, but it also highlighted how his life had been turned upside down by false accusations. "Sheriff Johnson, It's awful to think my reputation could be attacked again by the lies of a desperate criminal, Michael said, his voice heavy with sadness. Michael, I completely understand your frustration, Sheriff Johnson replied. But I want to assure you that this time we won't make the same mistakes. There's no physical evidence supporting Scott's claims, and your reputation in the community speaks louder than the words of a convicted criminal. The sheriff explained he had called Michael to inform him of the situation before he heard it through other sources. I wanted you to hear it from me first, so you could prepare in case the information leaks to the community, he said. I think I should call Richard right away, Michael said, referring to his brother-in-law, the lawyer who had defended him before. He needs to know about this new development. Sheriff Johnson agreed it would be wise to have legal representation, even if the accusations seemed baseless. When Michael called Richard and explained the situation, the lawyer was visibly annoyed by Scott Williams Anderson's attempt to implicate an innocent man. Michael, this is a desperate move by a criminal who knows he's facing years in prison, Richard said. Don't worry, I'll handle this immediately. Richard explained he was familiar with similar cases where criminals tried to drag innocent people into their mess, hoping for more favorable deals with the prosecution. The difference is that this time we have complete documentation of your innocence and solid testimonies from the community, assured Richard. The lawyer promised to contact the district attorney in Chicago directly to present all the evidence of Michael's innocence and to demand that Scott's accusations be dismissed. Michael, I won't let you go through this again, Richard vowed firmly. When Michael got home and told Jennifer about the new situation, she was visibly shaken. The stress from the first accusation was still fresh in her memory, and the thought of reliving that nightmare was terrifying. Michael, I can't go through this again, she confessed, tears welling in her eyes. Jennifer, this time will be different, Michael reassured her, embracing his wife tenderly. Everyone in town knows I'm innocent. Sheriff Johnson is on our side. Richard is already handling everything. They won't be able to hurt me again. His words were confident, but deep down Michael felt the same anxiety as Jennifer. Ryan and Emily, now older and more aware of adult troubles, immediately sensed something was wrong when they came home from school. Dad, Mom, are you okay? Ryan asked, noticing the tension in the air. Did something happen? Michael and Jennifer decided to be honest with their children, explaining the situation carefully to avoid unnecessary alarm. One of the men who was arrested is trying to blame me for his crimes, Michael explained. But everyone knows it's a lie and nothing will come of it. Emily was outraged by the news. But Dad, that's not fair. You already went through this once and now this man wants to do it again. Her anger was genuine and touching, showing how much the family had grown through their past hardships. Emily, sometimes bad people do unfair things, Jennifer explained patiently. But now we're better prepared to handle it. We know our rights. We have an excellent lawyer, and the whole community supports us. Jennifer's words were as much to comfort her daughter as to strengthen her own confidence. The following evening, Michael received a call from Earl Simmons, who had learned about the new situation from Sheriff Johnson himself. Michael, this criminal is lying shamelessly, Earl said indignantly. I watched those men for weeks, and I never saw you with them. I'll give as many statements as needed. Earl's solidarity, from a man still considered eccentric by many in town, deeply moved Michael. Earl, I appreciate your support once again, Michael said emotionally. Your friendship has been one of the best things to come out of this whole terrible situation. Harold Peterson also reached out, offering any help necessary to prove Michael's innocence. Michael, all of us who were victims of these criminals know you had nothing to do with them, Harold said. Anyone who believes Scott's lies needs their head examined. The community's support was overwhelming. Mrs. Betty, Michael's secretary, spontaneously organized an informal campaign of support, collecting letters from people who knew Michael and could vouch for his character. Dr. Thompson, we won't let this criminal destroy your reputation with lies, Mrs. Betty declared firmly. Father Michael also spoke publicly in Michael's defense during Sunday Mass, without naming names, but making it clear the community should stand by upstanding members facing baseless accusations. We must be like the Good Samaritan, the priest said, helping our brothers when they need it most. The district attorney in Chicago, William Peters, met with Richard in his office the following Monday. Richard presented a complete dossier on Michael, including all the community testimonies, evidence from the first investigation, and a detailed timeline that proved the impossibility of Scott Williams Anderson's allegations. Dr. Richard, after reviewing all this documentation, "It's clear that Mr. Scott Williams Anderson's claims are completely unfounded," said District Attorney William Peters after carefully examining all the documents. "There's no basis for any kind of accusation against Mr. Michael Thompson." Richard felt immense relief hearing the prosecutor's decision. "Dr. William, I appreciate your thorough analysis of the case," Richard said. "My client already endured significant trauma from the first false accusation. It's important that his innocence be officially recognized." The prosecutor agreed to issue an official statement dismissing Scott Williams Anderson's allegations and reaffirming that Michael Thompson had no involvement in the crimes. "I'll also recommend that Scott be prosecuted for perjury," added District Attorney Peters. When Richard called Michael with the good news, the entire Thompson family felt a weight lift from their shoulders. "Michael, it's all officially resolved," Richard announced. "The prosecutor completely dismissed the allegations and is prosecuting Scott for lying. You're free from any suspicion." The news spread quickly through town, bringing a sense of justice finally being served. Mrs. Parker was one of the first to visit the Thompsons to congratulate them on their victory. "I always said that Michael is an upstanding man," she declared to anyone who would listen. Sheriff Johnson made a point of visiting Michael personally to congratulate him on the swift resolution of the case and to apologize for him having to endure such a situation again. "Michael, I'm sorry you were subjected to this injustice once more," the sheriff said sincerely. "Sheriff Johnson, this time was different," Michael replied gratefully. "You treated me with respect from the start, investigated properly before drawing conclusions, and kept the community informed. That made all the difference." The comparison between the two experiences highlighted how much had been learned. The second attempt to frame Michael only strengthened his standing in the community. People saw how he maintained his dignity even when facing a second wave of accusations, and how the truth once again prevailed over lies. "Michael, you're an example of how an honorable person should carry themselves," the town mayor remarked during a chance encounter on the street. "The way you've handled these adversities inspires us all." Michael thanked him, but still preferred a quiet life away from the spotlight. Scott Williams Anderson was later convicted of perjury in addition to his other charges, receiving an even harsher sentence. Justice had been fully served, and the attempts to harm Michael had only backfired on the criminal. The experience taught Michael that malicious people will always find ways to target the innocent, but also that a solid reputation built over years is the best defense against slander. "Jennifer, now I understand why my parents always insisted on the importance of maintaining a clean reputation," Michael reflected. "And I see why it's important to have a community that knows and supports us," Jennifer added. "If we'd been alone in this fight, proving our innocence would have been much harder." The observation underscored the value of genuine human connections. A year after the second attempt to frame him, Michael had become something of an informal counselor for people in the community facing legal troubles or reputation issues. His unique experience gave him credibility to help others in similar situations. "Michael, your story teaches us that the truth always finds a way," said Mary Johnson, a local shopkeeper who had been falsely accused of tax irregularities. "How your example gave me the strength to fight for my innocence." Michael felt gratified knowing his experience could help others. The friendship between Michael and Earl Simmons had grown even stronger during the second crisis. Earl had once again stood firmly by Michael's side, showing a loyalty that deeply touched the accountant. "Earl, you're proof that the best friends sometimes come from the most unexpected places," said Michael. "Michael, honest men recognize other honest men," Earl replied with his characteristic simplicity. "We don't need many words to know who we can trust." Their friendship had become one of the most valuable aspects of the entire traumatic experience. 3 years after the first incident, Michael decided to write a detailed account of his experiences, not for publication, but as a record for his future children and grandchildren. I want them to understand the importance of keeping their integrity even when it's hard, he explained to Jennifer. Michael's account included not just the factual events, but also the emotional and spiritual lessons he had learned. I've discovered that our true strength isn't in avoiding adversity, but in how we respond to it, he wrote, and that the support of a community who knows us is worth more than any material wealth. Richard suggested Michael consider sharing his story more widely, perhaps through talks at schools or community groups. Michael, your experience could educate people about the dangers of rushing to judgment and the importance of the presumption of innocence, the lawyer argued. Michael was hesitant at first, preferring to keep his privacy, but eventually agreed to speak occasionally to small groups when asked. If my experience can prevent others from going through what we did, it's worth sharing, he decided. Michael's first talk was for a group of young people at the local school, where he spoke about the importance of not judging based on appearances or rumors. You are the future of this community, he told the students. Learn to know people before judging them and have the courage to stand by your friends when they need you. The talk was so well received that Michael was invited to speak at other schools in the area. His simple yet powerful message about integrity, community, and forgiveness resonated with audiences of all ages. I never imagined I'd become a speaker, Michael joked with Jennifer after a particularly successful presentation. You've always been a good communicator, Jennifer replied proudly. Now you have an important story to share. It's only natural people want to hear it. Jennifer's support was crucial to Michael's confidence in his new activities. Michael Thompson's legacy in Pine Valley went beyond his personal experience with injustice. He had become a symbol of how to face adversity with dignity and how to build bridges instead of walls in a community. Michael's story has changed our town in subtle but important ways, Father Michael observed during a conversation with other community leaders. Now we're more careful in our judgments and more willing to support each other in hard times. The most significant transformation, however, had happened within the Thompson family itself. The shared experience had strengthened their bonds in a way that years of ordinary life never could. We've been through fire together, as Jennifer liked to say, and came out stronger on the other side. Ryan, now 19 and studying law, often cited his father's experience as inspiration for his career choice. I want to defend innocent people like my dad, he said with conviction. I want to make sure justice is truly just. Emily, at 17, had developed an interest in psychology, specifically in how people cope with trauma and adversity. The way our family faced this crisis fascinates me, she explained. I want to understand how some people can turn suffering into growth. The trail where Michael had found the fateful backpack became a personal pilgrimage site for him. At least, once a month, he walked to the exact spot where it all began, not with bitterness but with gratitude for the journey that followed. It's strange to feel grateful for something that caused us so much pain, Michael reflected during one of these visits accompanied by Earl. But I can't deny I became a better person because of this experience. Earl nodded silently, understanding the complex feeling perfectly. The green backpack that had changed Michael's life was never returned by the criminals or found among their possessions. It had become part of the case evidence, but symbolically it continued to represent how seemingly insignificant objects can completely alter the course of our lives. Sometimes I wonder where that backpack is now, Michael said during a conversation with Sheriff Johnson, who had become a friend over the years. I hope it's somewhere where it can't cause any more misunderstandings. The sheriff laughed at the remark, appreciating the humor Michael had developed about his ordeal. 5 years after the first incident, Pine Valley had become regionally known not just for its natural beauty, but also for the exemplary way its community had handled a crisis of justice. Other towns sent delegations to learn about the protocols that had been implemented to prevent wrongful arrests. Our town has become a model for how justice and community can work together, Sheriff Johnson observed during one such visit. And it all started with one good man's terrible yet transformative experience. Michael was embarrassed by the attention, but recognized the educational value of his story. The experience had taught him that the true measure of a person isn't in avoiding trouble, but in how they respond when it arises. "We never choose our adversities," he often said in his talks, "but we can always choose how we react to them." And so, the man who had been handcuffed and arrested for doing the right thing found in the injustice, he suffered an opportunity for personal growth and community service he never imagined possible. His journey of pain had transformed into a source of wisdom and inspiration for everyone around him. The green backpack may have vanished from official records, but its lesson remained etched in the collective memory of Pine Valley, that truth may be temporarily obscured but never permanently destroyed, and that a united community is the best defense against individual injustice. End of story. And you, what did you think of this story of injustice and resilience? Have you ever been in a situation where you were judged unfairly? Share in the comments your thoughts on how Michael handled this adversity. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel.